Hey, everybody. This is Chief of Learner Success, Enrico E. Manalo. Not here with an Intentionally Act Live episode. I'm actually here to start our new vlog. Today, what I'm going to be talking to you about is actually something that has come in from my personal life. And like many people, I'm part of a number of different online communities. And this interaction happened with between myself and somebody who I've known for about 10 years. And it was actually in response to something that I posted elsewhere. The article in question that started all of this off was actually this one. I'll just share my screen really quickly. Yes, so it was this article on Catapult called Hiring a Chief Diversity Officer Won't Fix Your Racist Company Culture. Overall, I think it's a pretty good read. I think it's timely, it's relatable. And so I was a little bit surprised when somebody wrote to me in response to that article. So I'm not going to take you through the entire conversation, but I am going to bring in some of the threads. And just for your information, for transparency's sake, my friend and I have actually, we both came away feeling like it was a good, productive conversation. But I'll be the first to admit, I wasn't sure where the conversation was going at first. So here's how it started. My friend, who I will refer to as G, to protect their privacy, started out like this. G, this was a post. Now it's a PM. Rico, I know this is your jam, and I know this is what you do, and I firmly believe it is work worth doing. And I firmly believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion are goals every company should set. But I want you to know how this looks from the other side. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I've received any kind of communication or had a conversation that started off this way, I'm never quite sure where it's going to go. When I've got my conflict hat on, that's kind of exciting. Although, like anybody else, if I'm not prepared for it, I can be a little bit conflict shy. So given that we were both part of an online community, and I've seen that, on many of these online communities, people really kind of take each other to task. And certainly my friend G has been known to do that on occasion, especially when somebody's thinking is faulty. So I already had all of that in my mind going into this conversation. Right, so here's my response. Hey, G, long time, no interaction. First things first, thank you. And I really wanted to thank G because I know that G would not reach out to me privately unless it was something that G thought was really actually serious. And so I wanted to probe a little bit deeper on why this was a private message and not in a comment thread, for example. So what G said to me is, I took it private because of fear of reprisal, frankly. You can't, as a white person, say fuck all about DEI. Given the broad makeup of society right now, as well as who our villains are, I actually have no problem with that. The beef I have is that there seems to be this inherited understanding that the role of minority advocates is to shout at white people, and the role of white people is to remove themselves entirely from any environment in which they might be shouted at, because any participation whatsoever is privilege. So there are a lot of ways that I could take this, but something about what G is getting at really resonated with me. And I do think it's true that right now, in the context of cancel culture, if you are perceived to be speaking against something that generally people are on board with saying is generally good, then people are typically not so curious about why. All right, so people will see the thing, they will have an emotional reaction, and then they'll dive right in. From a conflict perspective, this is well, let's just say that it's maybe not the best way to manage conflict in your life, right? And I think what G is bringing up is actually valid. And if we can't interrogate the state of DEI or anti-racism or racial equity, then like if we can't bring any criticism into that space, then it's actually really hard to get a sense of what's effective or what could be changed. When we can't take things apart to look at whether or not they're working, we run the very real risk of in fact replicating or perpetuating harm that is not intended. And, you know, because a lot of DEI, anti-racism, and racial equity are oriented toward healing, that's really kind of counterproductive. To continue, to make things worse, there's an advocacy arms race. Get the white people together, and it's all about scoring purity points. Now, this is G's framing, not mine. Since everyone is white, your best move is to lambaste other white people to demonstrate your wokeness. There's nothing quite like a bunch of white women attempting to champion minority rights by attacking white women who fail their purity test. The worst part? If you have a bunch of white women forced to deal with anyone but African Americans, everyone becomes white. You know, I think it's really easy to take a look at the language and the terminology being used here, and to make comments from the sidelines like, oh, this is a person with a lot of internalized oppression. This is a person that has not interrogated their own whiteness. And perhaps that's true. I'll be honest, I haven't spoken to G face-to-face for quite some time now. And certainly before I started working in racial equity. But I think if we're actually looking, if we're taking a critical eye here, and we're kind of moving past the language, which I will admit is not exactly the framing that I might choose. There are real seeds that resonate here with me, and I think they're actually worth talking about. And this idea of purity points, you know, sometimes we joke about woke tokens, or when people kind of have this mentality that, you know, somehow anti-racism or diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that you can win. And often that comes out of that kind of checkbox mentality. So kind of saying like, well, if we have 4 Black people working for us, if they're mostly women, if we have an Asian person, if we have LGBTQIA plus people working for us, then we've got diversity covered, right? Like that's simply not the way that works. To kind of return to that comment, the other thing that I was kind of picking up here, and again, not the way that I would necessarily couch this, but there have been a number of studies that have shown that, in fact, many diversity initiatives and programs, they benefit white women more than the target populations. So there is some validity running through this. And in a certain sense, well, not in a certain sense, but certainly there are people who have this kind of scarcity mindset, or zero-sum thinking, or thinking that everything is a win-lose scenario, that do tend toward creating a hierarchy of pain. And this is that oppression Olympics, right? So you'll hear people throw around that term like, oh, well, this isn't the oppression Olympics. And while that may be true, people are still in it to win it. So G is also a business owner, and is a very good storyteller in their own right. But given my personal interactions with G, and I know this is anecdotal, but I have every reason to believe that all of this is true. I have changed many details here. I have not changed the structure of anything, but certainly the identifying details I have changed, because above all else, I do want to protect G's privacy, especially because G was vulnerable with me. And that is something that I deeply appreciate. So G says, I've got 2 Peruvian employees. One of them is of European ancestry. One of them is half Chinese. Their school, and it's a local university there, modeled them both as white and beats them up about how to treat minorities. Meanwhile, they both know that the European descended one passes as European. Maybe Swedish, maybe Spanish, nobody knows. Well, the Chinese descended one gets called, and I'm not gonna say that word, but for those who are listening and not watching, it is a commonly used term for Chicanos or Mexican Americans. G continues, yet their sensitivity training was all about how many purity points African Americans get. It's a feeding frenzy. The only way white people can participate is by excoriating other white people, and increased diversity fundamentally means fire white people. So there's that zero-sum thinking again, right? So if we have a quota for diversity, like by the end of the year, we would love to get 10 Black women to work for us. Well, if you are thinking that if your organization is like 100 people and you are dead set on keeping it at 100 people, then to make room for 10 Black women on your staff, then it does stand to reason that 10 non-Black people must then therefore give up their spot in order to make that room. And this is really what I'm getting at with the scarcity mindset here, right? So when people think in these fixed terms and don't think about what I would call expanding the pie or finding other opportunities, or just kind of trying to strategize how else needs can be met and accommodated. I fucking believe that Mckinsey study. The study that G is talking about was a study that essentially showed that greater diversity means that there's greater innovation. And I will find the link to that and post that in the comments here. The more diversity of experience you have to work with, the more diversity of solutions you can choose from. So we keep doing the work. But we also know that doing the work means getting yelled at by absolutely everyone. So one of the great things that came out of this conversation was my friend G and I were able to really kind of explore that scarcity mindset, right? And the thing that kind of surfaced that for G was what I said was, you're right, there are no winners, and I don't think there should be. And let me tell you what I mean by that. We are acculturated. That means that our culture tells us that in our societies, there are winners, and if you are not winners, then you are losers. This is what we call binary thinking, right? So if we think of polar opposites, right? So hot, cold, left, right. Those are polar opposites. If we think about logical opposites, that's very different. The landscape changes, and I'll show you how. So the opposite of hot, logically, is not hot. It isn't cold. It's not hot. Therefore, the opposite of cold is not cold. There's still kind of space between not cold and not hot for other things to exist, right? But if you're thinking that there are only 2 choices, then you'll only come up with 2 solutions. But in that second structure that I just went over very briefly, there are actually 4 obvious choices, as well as the unstated choice of like, well, what's between not hot and not cold? And all of that's important because when people don't perceive that there are other avenues, they end up doing the same things over and over again. And that kind of awareness of a lack of progress, or of not accomplishing what you're trying to in the ways that you know how, can actually work to shut people down. So if we can't find more solutions to realistically address diversity, equity, inclusion, racism, then really our hands are tied. But the world isn't based on scarcity, no matter what economists tell us. I mean, sorry, Dad, my father is an economics professor. And in fact, this is how innovation kind of comes into play. It changes paradigms and allows us to see opportunities that were not obvious before. In my world, that is conflict management and conflict resolution, conflict is seen as actually a clarifying tool. It's something that can help us to see the other options that we didn't even know exist. I also want to mention that what G's experiencing is real. And I believe that. I believe that as a Filipino American man. I believe that as a BIPOC person, however you want to identify me. I really think that this scarcity mindset has fed into the idea that for BIPOC to win, white people have to lose. And that couldn't be further from the truth. If we really want to address our societal ills, well, then it's going to take our society to address that ill, right? Like when one part of the body is harmed, we don't isolate that part of the body from the rest of the body. Blood has to flow. Things have to move. Cells have to move what is no longer working out of the way so that healing can really take place. To continue on that metaphor, healing takes a lot of time. It's uncomfortable. It's itchy. You might want to pick at the scab. You might end up with a scar from that healing process that's a little bit different than the wound that was originally inflicted. But it does heal, and sometimes healing takes a little bit of help. So I think what I really want to accomplish with this vlog is to just kind of, to talk about the scarcity mindset and how that really limits our options. But I think one of the things we have to remember as we engage in this work is that white people are in this too. We talk a lot about the burden of racism and how Black and brown people, and often, perhaps more often, Black people tend to have to bear that burden, or a heavier burden than others. And that's not fair. I'd also like to highlight that in some ways, if white people really want to be part of the healing process that is going to get us out of all of the harm done by racism, well, they're going to have to bear some of that burden too. There's been much that's been said about white fragility. It doesn't resonate with everybody, and that's fine. But I will say this. Bearing the burden of racism, it's not something that I've ever gotten used to. I know for sure that I don't have it nearly as bad as some of my Black and brown brothers and sisters. But again, it's not about that, right? If somebody like me can still be harmed by racism, well, imagine what it will do to somebody who is in a much more vulnerable position than myself. One analogy that's kind of popping into my mind is, if you've never had a chili pepper before, then there's no way that you can handle all the heat that a really experienced chili head like myself might actively seek out. That's not to say that somebody can't develop that capacity, but if we want people to really build that capacity, we have to give them the opportunity to do so. And we have to do it in a way that doesn't make them feel awful the entire time until they're, arbitrarily at whatever will satisfy us individually. We talk about equity a lot in terms of racism. And in some sense, we also have to offer equity to our white brothers and sisters as well. I think ultimately what I want to do today is to acknowledge pain and to say to the public, to the community, certainly, that if we can't talk about this pain, if we can't talk about, the guilt that sometimes goes along with that, if we can't help people to process their emotions, they'll never really get to the place where we really need them to be so that they can stand alongside us. Anyway, thank you all for listening. Once again, all identifying details have been changed. And yeah, I guess I'll see you on intentionallyact.com. Thanks so much. Bye.